Good day. Today I am going to be doing a video to cover here on the Duran the questions that we got asked in our live streams, our two live streams that we did this week. The first was on Tuesday with myself, Gonzalo Lira and Dima from the Military Summary channel. And the second was the live stream that we did on Thursday with myself and the great Robert Barnes. Now, many of you are asking what has happened to my friend and colleague, Alex Christoforou. The answer is that Alex is well and full of energy and is as busy as always and is producing content as always. Unfortunately, it cannot be published for the moment on YouTube for roughly a week. Publication has been restricted because of something that took place a year and a half ago, which I'm not going to discuss on this program. All I would say is that, of course, this has acted as a further reminder, if any were needed, that what is given can always be taken away. You can find all of Alex's content on our other platforms, first and foremost on Locals, but also on Rumble, on ODYSEE, and on SuperU, and of course also on our Telegram channel. And you'll find links to all of these other places, other platforms under this video. Can I also say that obviously if you want to be absolutely sure in future that no matter what happens, you will be guaranteed to receive all our content, then of course it's to those other platforms perhaps that you should go. Anyway, without more ado, I will now deal with the various questions that have been asked. And I'm going to start with the questions from the live stream, which took place on Tuesday with myself, Gonzalo, and Dima from the Military Summary channel. And the first comment was from Zionic 8, and it's thanks guys, I miss you Alex, we all do, and thanks Dima. And we all thank Dima as well. Moro and Shoria Shikar also sent messages. And Rahul Pinto says, keep it up, the Duran and the community, and love you guys. And can I just say thank you for that? And also thanks to all the support that we always get from the community. This is in fact what makes this sort of work important and worthwhile. And then we've had further comments from Lentak FFM and Paul, that's to say messages I think, and perhaps some super chats, or at least who knows, but anyway, things from them. But I'll go now on to the next point from Lana Zenkova Garcia. Russians are worried about American military equipment because it kills Russians. I agree with Alexander that strategically it will not stop Russia. However, much more Russian lives will be lost. Absolutely. And that's exactly what we see happening. I'm going to make a general observation about this. This war, as I've discussed many times, as we've discussed many times on the Duran, should never have started. There was a real possibility of negotiating its end in March. It has been unreasonably and disastrously prolonged because the Western powers, first and foremost the Biden administration and the Johnson government in Britain, acted to block off a negotiation option in March and instead have stepped up military deliveries to Ukraine. That is not going to change the outcome of the war, but it is going to prolong the war, and it is going to result in the deaths and woundings of many, many more people, as well as put in danger the survival of Ukraine as a state and trigger a worldwide economic crisis. So these weapons deliveries are misconceived, to my mind, from many aspects. But putting that aside, there's no doubt at all that from a Russian point of view, they have cost Russians lives, and this is something that the Russians are fully aware of, are concerned about, and will not forget. So Soberano, Brazil, there are informations of battalions of Polish army and people from the Polish army already in Ukraine. Do you think it can get on an even bigger scale? Will the Polish people accept it? Right, I think that I've not heard information about complete battalions of the Polish army in Ukraine. I follow the military summary channel every day. I haven't seen any report to that effect on the military summary channel. It seems to me that there are large numbers of Polish advisors and instructors and those sort of people in Ukraine, and there's also volunteers, Polish volunteers, some of them in formed units that are fighting alongside the Ukrainian army, though I don't think that they are actually formal regular units of the Polish army or necessarily regular Polish soldiers. Now, there's been much debate and discussion about whether Poland will intervene militarily in Ukraine. There's been suggestions that it may do. So far, it hasn't. My own sense is that the Russians, some weeks ago, made clear their strong opposition to any Polish military involvement in Ukraine, direct Polish military involvement in Ukraine. And I also get the sense that other NATO states like Germany and France are very unenthusiastic, indeed altogether negative about that idea. And I think for that reason, the Poles are holding back. And for the moment, I think that remains the position. I don't think that necessarily, I don't personally think that's going to change, but obviously the possibility that it may do so is there. Will the Polish people accept it? I'm afraid many will, some won't. Over time, as casualties mount, which they will, as Poland's forces in Ukraine get hit and Polish soldiers die, I strongly suspect that the mood in Poland will change. But of course, we're not at that point yet. So Harry C. Smith, Snakes Island sits on the edge of one of the two Russian escorted shipping channels. Excellent way to ensure and safeguard these ships' security. I don't actually see that myself. It's very small. It's less than 1 kilometre square. If you put a garrison on Snakes Island, it's going to be just a few dozen men. And it's not realistically possible to equip them with any powerful equipment. They can't have anti-ship missiles in any quantity. They can't have large numbers of anti-aircraft missiles. Installing such systems on Snake Island is impractical. They wouldn't have reloads. So I don't really think that Snakes Island is actually that important anymore. And Dima seemed to take the same view. His view, and by the way, my own view, and I discussed it elsewhere, is that it was useful to provide to the Russians at the outset of the war, in order to prevent the Ukrainians installing observation outposts on Snakes Island to keep track on what the Moskva, the Russian cruiser, was doing. And the cruiser was there, I think, in order to keep track with its powerful radar system of what was going on in NATO territory, specifically on the Romanian and Bulgarian coast. But after the Moskva was sunk, like Dima, I think Snakes Island lost all its military utility to both sides. I think it is of minimal, if any, use to commercial shipping. I don't really see what relevance it has to commercial shipping. It's not actually quite as close to Odessa as I think some people think it is. And frankly, I think, like Dima, that today it's only symbolic. So Kyle Wöhler also sends a message. I suspect these are just greetings messages and perhaps small donations, but or perhaps big donations. But anyway, whatever it was, thank you for that, Kyle Wöhler. Zachary Bendixson. 1 million man army equals 90% bullshit, 90%ish bullet sponges. It would be tragic if Ukraine uses human wave Zerg tactics. I don't personally take this million man army business at all seriously. Conceivably, if you counted every single person under arms in Ukraine and then added another 300,000 on top of the 700,000 people that Ukraine has in its armed forces, then you might get 1 million men. But my own view is that only a fraction of these, probably a small fraction, are really suitable for intense infantry combat. And as for mobilizing this 1 million man force into one place and launching it against a Kherson region, I think this is completely impractical. I think this is utter fantasy. I don't think there's the means either to equip such a force or to train such a force, and the logistics of keeping such a force supplied are far beyond the capabilities of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian state, even with the full support of NATO. So I just don't think that this is a realistic option. Stephen Hartley. Why do the Russians not use their conscripts when they invaded Ukraine? I think there's two straightforward reasons why they didn't. Firstly, because I think that using conscripts might have been politically problematic. It might have upset the families of these young people. And in any event, conscripts form a useful reserve pool and are needed in order to defend Russian territory, where undoubtedly they would fight and fight very courageously. But I think there is a second reason, which is I think that the Russians' decision to use a professional, an all-professional force in this campaign in Ukraine was dictated to a very great extent by the complexities of this war and the feeling that it was best handled by full-time professional soldiers. And I think we can see that that is correct. So, command unit, HIMARS systems don't give the Ukrainians anything new, but it allows them to fire their missiles more liberally because they have replacements. I don't fully agree with this. It seems to me that the HIMARS has to be understood as a hybrid system. It is both a multiple rocket launch system, and it is also a system capable of launching over quite long distances, 300 kilometers, guided missiles. Multiple rocket launch systems historically only launched unguided rockets. The HIMARS is capable of launching guided missiles as well. By the way, and this is an important point which I don't think is widely known, but the more advanced and modern Russian multiple rocket launch systems, like the Tornado, possess the same capability. They too can launch guided missiles, and apparently the ranges that they can launch these missiles are roughly the same as those of the HIMARS. But the point is, whilst the Russians have a very large number of extremely long range and very powerful precision guided systems, Ukraine doesn't. Ukraine's had to rely on the Soviet era Tochka-U system. And that system is not as accurate as the HIMARS. And besides, the Russians are very, very familiar with it, and they've shown a consistent ability to intercept it. Now, the Russians can intercept the HIMARS missiles, and they're learning more about them every day. And if it's true, by the way, that they've been able to acquire one through corruption, something which I'm far from convinced is the case, but there are rumors to that effect, then obviously they're going to learn even more about the HIMARS system. But they're learning more about it every day. They're going to certainly perfect their air defense capabilities against it. I think that the HIMARS has only a limited time window in which it is an especially effective system. The Russians in time will develop both a capability to intercept it and an understanding of its tactical and other limitations. And so I don't think the HIMARS will be effective for very long. On top of that, Ukraine has apparently been provided with something like a third of the total stock of HIMARS missiles that have been produced by the United States, which is between 6,000 and 8,000 missiles. Now, I should say these are not all of them precision-guided systems. Most of them, I suspect, are unguided systems. So if we're talking about 6,000 to 8,000 of these missiles, bear in mind that Ukraine uses around 5,000 to 6,000 rounds of artillery ammunition every day. You will see that if the Ukrainians use these systems on an intense basis, they will almost certainly run through their stock of these missiles fairly quickly, whereas it seems that the Russians have an almost unlimited number of missiles, comparable missiles, or actually more effective, far longer range missiles that they can continue to use. So I do think it provides an additional capability. I don't think it is a game changer system. So Crestcutter, how will the West frame the story when Russia wins in Ukraine? They're so heavily invested in a Ukrainian victory that it's pretty much impossible. What will they blame? Who will be their scapegoat? Well, as to the last, I predict it will be the Biden administration and probably the president. In fact, unquestionably, it will be the president. I'm sure that is what will be said. There'll be all sorts of recriminations, all sorts of hand-wringing about it. People will say, there'll be long debates about who lost Ukraine, just as there were when China was lost and when Vietnam was lost and when Afghanistan was lost, and as there's been over the Iraq war too. I agree that with every day that this conflict continues, a defeat, a comprehensive defeat for Ukraine, becomes for the West an ever greater debacle and a more difficult one to explain away. Sanjeeva Herath, talking about Ukrainian losses. Dima, your numbers don't add up. If Ukrainian killed in action is 50,000 and 150,000 wounded, that's based on the assumption 50,000 dead, 130 that wounded are 3 times greater than the numbers of dead. Then how is it that only 20% of the Ukrainian armed forces are involved in the Donbass? If 200,000 are already gone, what is left of the Ukrainian armed forces to fight in Donbass? Well, that's perhaps something I should pass on to Dima, but for the record, I tend to agree with you, Sanjeeva. I think that, shall we say, what Dima is looking at, a large number of forces that Ukraine still has, at least nominal forces that it still has in reserve, mostly now deployed, so far as I can see, around Odessa, Nikolaev, opposite Kherson region. But I don't see these as representing 80% of Ukraine's armed forces or anything close. I'd say significantly less than half from what I can see. Remember, Ukraine has its forces in Donbass, which are gradually being destroyed. It's got forces trying to defend Zaporozhye. It's got forces in Donbass, in Dnipropetrovsk, opposite Donbass. And of course, it's also got forces in Kharkiv, and it's also having to keep some forces back to protect Kiev. My own opinion about this, which is different from Dima's, is that I agree roughly that the Russians are only using around a fifth, perhaps even less than that, of their military power in Ukraine. Significantly less than a fifth. Where I disagree with Dima is I don't think Ukraine is using a fifth of its military power. I think it is exerting all its force in the multiple fronts that this war, in which this war is happening. I mean, its military spearhead was in Donbass, and that is being destroyed. But the forces that it has elsewhere are also, in one form or another, deployed in the battle. And of course, whilst Russian forces can withdraw deep into Russia or train deep in Russia or be re-equipped deep in Russia, far from any possibility of a Ukrainian military strike, there is no part of Ukraine which the Russians cannot reach, as they have consistently shown. So I think that it's true that the Russians are using only a fifth of their power in Ukraine, perhaps even less. By contrast, I think Ukraine is already using all the power it has and is exhausting itself. So this is one point where Dima and I disagree. But I will pass this on to Dima, and I will see what his views about this are. So, Smug Buddha, in Syria, after the Russians and Syrians defeated Al-Qaeda ISIS in Aleppo, the John Kerry US State Department shifted to Plan B, which is the strangulation or life local population, no trade, no medicine, no food. Will there be a repeat? And the short answer is no. Syria is a small country, relatively speaking. It's cut off from the major trade routes. It's easy to some extent to blockade Syria. You can blockade. It's close. To some extent that happens. There's Turkey to the north, which is hostile. There's Jordan to the east, which is and south, which is, if not exactly hostile, less than friendly. And of course, Iraq is generally friendly to Syria, but is not wholly reliable because it is not at peace in itself. And of course, there's large numbers of foreign troops on Syrian territory. There's Turkish troops, and there's also some Americans. Now, Ukraine would be completely different, and Russia is completely different. Russia is a huge self-sufficient economy. If Ukraine is connected to Russia, then it becomes part of that giant economic system. And as we've seen, China is continuing commercial trade with Russia, as India also is. So from a Russian point of view, they're obviously not being suffocated, as we can see, and neither would a Ukraine that was reincorporated into the Russian system, or any parts of Ukraine which are reincorporated into the Russian system. So far, the effect of the sanctions is not to suffocate the Russians. It is to suffocate the European economies, which are in deep, deep crisis. Rafael Ligonde asks, do you get your data from the State Department? No, of course not. Neither we nor the Military Summary Channel. I mean, we look at the Duran, at what the State Department says. I don't think Demas wastes much time with the State Department, actually, but he certainly looks at what the Western powers say. And, you know, this Institute for the Study of War, which operates in Washington under the aegis of the Kagan family. But in neither case do we base all our data from the State Department. I mean, that would be completely inconceivable. Sanjeeva Herath, why would Ukraine announce their war plans before they launch them, whatever their goals? Even if their aim is to cause damage to Russia, why announce the southern campaign? More effective if it's a surprise, isn't it? I mean, it's actually an excellent question. It's a question that I brought up over the course of the programme. I mean, it does seem bizarre that if you're going to plan some great offensive, that you should announce it weeks in advance, thereby giving the other side, the Russians in this case, all the time they need to prepare in order to deal with it. I think there are two reasons. Firstly, Ukraine is doing it in order to sustain internal morale. Ukraine is losing the war in Donbass, and it's losing it relentlessly, and it is taking massive losses. So it's got to keep up the hopes of its people by talking about a successful counteroffensive in southwest Ukraine. And that's one reason why they're doing that. The second reason is to persuade the Western powers that Ukraine is still in the running, that it's still able to keep on fighting, that it's still able to sustain the war, that it's not about to collapse, so that Ukraine can that way continue to persuade the Western powers to provide Ukraine with military and financial support. So I think that's why the Ukrainians are doing it, even though, as you absolutely correctly say, from a military point of view, it makes absolutely no sense at all. There may be a third reason, by the way, and it's one which has been floated by the Russians, and that is that there might be some desire in Ukraine to scare the people in Kherson region, to keep them from committing fully to the Russian side and from participating in this referendum which the Russians are talking about staging in Kherson region, which would, if it were to take place, which might, if it were to take place, result in a vote for union with Russia. So I think these are the primary reasons why the Ukrainians are doing it. In other words, it has no military logic, but it serves what are, I suppose, ultimately public relations, or if you prefer, propaganda purposes. And Budweiser, thank you also for your message, your donation, I suppose. Tabanak, can there be a pivot east if Europe is in conflict? Well, if you're talking about Russia, the answer is yes, and there already is. I mean, we've seen already how rapidly the Russians have been able to transfer their oil sales from Europe to Asia, from Europe to India and China. And the latest news, by the way, that we're getting is that the Russians are now supplying fuel oil to the Gulf states, to the Middle East states, to Saudi Arabia included. And the reason is that the Saudis apparently need that oil to keep their cooling systems going through the summer, and so as to provide more oil for Saudi Arabia itself to produce and export. And here you see the paradox of the sanctions, because what that implies is that this makes sense for the Saudis to do, because they're buying oil from Russia cheaply and they're able to export their own oil at a higher price. So that in effect, Russia is now subsidizing Saudi oil exports. But of course, that isn't working to the advantage of the West either. It shows how the sanctions war against Russia is breaking down at multiple levels. And Rafael Ligonde says, so Russia will lose 50,000 and Ukraine 200,000 IC. And I have to say, this is again where I take some issue with Dima. I accept Ukraine can absorb heavier losses than Russia can, though I do think, and I really do believe, that there is a finite point beyond which Ukraine cannot just go on taking these kind of losses. I think there's an important point to make about this, about the Vietnam parallel that Dima made. The first point, and I made it in the program, is that the 2 million dead Vietnamese includes a large number of Vietnamese who fought in the South Vietnamese army. That is the army that fought along side the Americans, the US, against the communist North Vietnamese. There were two wars going on in Vietnam at one and the same time. There was the US military intervention in Vietnam, which was primarily a war, or became a war, between the United States and North Vietnam, and North Vietnam's allies in South Vietnam, the force that has become known as the Viet Cong. And there was also, alongside that war between the United States and North Vietnam and its Viet Cong allies, there was also a civil war between North Vietnam, between the communist north of Vietnam and, if you like, the pro-American capitalist South. Now, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong won both of those wars. And it's important to stress again that many of those casualties that were suffered in Vietnam, those 2 million casualties, many of them were the result of the losses experienced by the South Vietnamese. Now, the other point to say about the 2 million losses is that, of course, very few, only a fraction of those 2 million people who died in Vietnam were soldiers. Because, of course, one of the features of the Vietnam War was this tremendous bombing war that the United States engaged in over the course of the Vietnam War. Again, it's difficult to say exactly what the numbers were, but large numbers of people died as a result of that bombing war. Probably the greater part of that 2 million number that we're hearing about were civilians who died either directly from the bombing or from its consequences, the massive disruption in the civilian economies, both in North and South Vietnam, as a result of the bombing. And I suspect that has played a major part in accumulating those numbers. North Vietnam, its military, certainly didn't take 2 million casualties. Had it done so, it would not have been able to sustain and win the war. That would have been impossible in the context of the North Vietnamese population of the 1960s and early 1970s, which from memory was something like 15 to 20 million people. So I think that's a point which I do want to make. I think that here again, perhaps Dima got a little bit, went a little bit further than perhaps the historical facts might suggest. I think he's right that Ukraine is both willing and able to absorb more casualties than Russia is, and I think it is definitely absorbing more casualties than Russia is. But frankly, I think we were talking about the kind of casualties that Ukraine can take before its military casualties that Ukraine can take before its military starts to fall apart, then we're talking about the hundreds of thousands, at most, absolutely not the millions. And frankly, if Ukraine were to lose 200,000 men, I don't personally think that Ukraine were able to sustain the whole war. And Tyler Durden says, this is Orwellian. And have a beer, Alex. Cheers. Well, thank you for that. I certainly will. And I would agree. I think it is Orwellian. So much about this war is Orwellian. Bridget Vickers, again, thank you for, I'm sure, your donation or whatever it was. Zandanga, thanks for keeping us informed. God bless and keep you safe. And God bless you, Zandanga, and keep you safe too. And Sanjeeva Herath, Dima, can you please let us know about the capability of Ukraine to inflict a massive reversal on Russian gains? I think Dima answered that over the course of the program. He thinks that Ukraine might just possibly be able to win back some ground in Kherson region. They might be able, for example, to push the Russians back from the west bank of the Dnieper River. But he seems skeptical that they can achieve more than this. In which case, I have to say that it looks like, to me, it looks like a repeat of the Kharkov counteroffensive of May, when, if you remember, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians all the way back to the Russian border, exhausted themselves doing so, and have subsequently been pushed all the way back to Kharkov again. So it doesn't look to me like a massive reversal. So that's my own view of this. The only thing I would say is, if Dima's estimations are that a massive battle is about to happen in Kharkov, in Kherson region, then of course the cost will be vastly greater than the offensive that was involved in the offensive in Kherson, which to say it straightforwardly, didn't involve large numbers of troops on either side. So Possum Power, thank you for your kind words about Alex and what has happened to him. Poppy and Eric Halverson, again, thank you for your donations, such they were. Zionic 8 welcomes Dima, and so do we on the Duran, and we expect and hope to have him many times on our programs. Jeffik the Hussar, do I think there is anyone in the British Parliament that does not put Ukraine first, but who actually wants to keep the people and the economy of Britain? There are, I'm going to guess, perhaps 50 MPs who might be queasy and unhappy about the Ukraine war and about Britain's role in it. These MPs are overwhelmingly Labour. I'm afraid there's very few Conservatives who would have contrary views. And these MPs, in the atmosphere of hysteria that there is in Britain over this war, are being very careful for the moment to keep their heads down. They're saying as little about it as possible. Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, I'm sure is one of them. I'm afraid the reality is they are marginalised and are of no political weight or significance at the moment. Ginsha, Putin signed a decree on Monday which offers fast-track Russian citizenship to all Ukrainian nationals plus stateless persons living in Ukraine. And the question seems to be addressed to Gonzalo, but that's I can answer that. It's absolutely true. That's exactly what Putin did. And I'm going to say something. The fact that he extended it to everyone in Ukraine strongly suggests to me that Putin's objectives now do extend to the entirety of Ukraine. Otherwise, why frame a law like this in such a wide way? Anyway, that's my own thoughts. Angry Warhawk, Gonzalo, will you be staying in Ukraine or what's left of it when this is all over? That's obviously a question for Gonzalo. We will pass it on to him and he will no doubt respond. Dominique, I'm amazed a senile president, even unable to read a prompter, could still find 30% prepared to vote for him in 2 years, when I will be a zombie. Well, I'm sure you will not be a zombie, Dominique. You're a person of extremely sharp mind, and I've no doubt that you will still be that in 2 years' time. But as for the reason why Biden continues to get 30% plus support, there's two reasons for that. Firstly, it's a point that Robert Barnes made on the live stream that I did with him on Thursday, and I will just take the opportunity to repeat what he said, which is that opinion polls in the United States have an inherent pro-Democrat bias. That's been shown repeatedly in elections and should be clearly understood. So that's one thing to say. The second is that, of course, the fact that Biden continues to get support reflects the intensity of divisions in the United States. There are, I'm sorry to say this, I mean, the fact is, there are people in the United States who would prefer a senile Biden, simply because he's a Democrat, over any Republican. And certainly they would prefer him over Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump stands again, I suspect that number who would prefer a senile Biden over Donald Trump might actually increase. So, just do bear that in mind. We're talking about a deeply divided and polarized nation. So Sanjeeva Herath, I think we have to acknowledge that HIMARS are very effective and potent in this conflict. Hope the Russians hunt them down quickly. I am sure the last is very, very much of a Russian priority. Now, I think HIMARS are effective and potent in this conflict, but I repeat what I said before in this program. I think that the Russians are already working on all kinds of counters to the HIMARS, and I think perfecting their air defense systems as well as hunting them down will be a high priority. And I think that the Russians are going to be cranking out many more armed drones over the next few months. The Russian deputy defense minister, Yuri Borisov, who is responsible for the Russian military procurement, for the military industrial complex, he has now straightforwardly said that producing drones for Russia is now a high priority. So that's what they're going to do. Rafael Ligonde says you're going to need 100,000 tanks, 100,000 artillery pieces, 400,000 military vehicles, 40,000 combinations of airplanes. Where you're going to stage them in Ukraine? Well, let's not talk in quite these vast numbers, but you're absolutely right in the essence of what you're saying. The number of forces, the number of weapon systems that Ukraine is demanding is incredible. They want 500. They want 500 tanks. They want 300 multiple rocket launch systems, HIMARS type systems. In other words, I believe a quarter of the total number of HIMARS systems which exist in the world. They want thousands of vehicles. Their demands are astronomical, and there are increasing numbers of people in the West, in Western procurement agencies, who are saying that Ukraine's demands are completely off the scale, far beyond what the United States and its allies at the moment can provide. So Ukraine, if it really were to get all of these weapon systems, would probably find it all but impossible to use them. How do you train your troops to absorb and use so many numbers of weapons quickly in the middle of a conflict? The answer is you can't. How do you conceal all these weapons in Ukraine, given that they would be obviously attracting Russian counterstrikes? And again, you can't. And realistically, Ukraine isn't going to get them anyway. At least not in anything like the numbers that Ukraine is asking for. And it remains the case that Ukraine is losing weapons faster than the West can replace them. Western arms deliveries have slowed the rate of attrition, but they have not stopped it. And far from it. And the West is coming quickly to the point where it cannot sustain even the current rate of arms deliveries for much longer. In fact, there are articles starting to appear in more and more places which suggest that, in fact, the greater number of arms deliveries to Ukraine from the West has already been made. And that from now on, the number of weapon systems Ukraine will be getting will start to dwindle as the Western powers start to worry about their own inventories. So Rafael Ligonde again. Guys, this is so absurd. A force of 1 million. Fort Bragg, the largest military base in the world, has a capacity of 100,000 total. You need 100 of it. Yeah, I agree. I mean, Ligonde, Rafael Ligonde, you're absolutely right. That is, it's simply an inflated total. There is no conceivable way that Ukraine can possibly, realistically, field a force of that on that kind of scale. I repeat, perhaps if you count every policeman, every cook, every person with a rifle in Ukraine, you might get a figure of 1 million. But in terms of an actual field army, a usable army, this figure of 1 million is completely unrealistic. It is a fantastic type of number. I mean, it's simply not something which Ukraine could remotely hope to sustain or deploy in reality or in a real war. So that ends the questions from the live stream with Gonzalo and Lira.